The world is a dark and cruel place, the universe indifferent, seemingly oblivious to the hopes and aspirations of mere man. Yet, with the razor of reason and the development of our intuitive faculties, we can shine an internal light outwards, which finds a way through this darkened realm. And if you'd like to follow such a path, perhaps you'd like to do so playing fantasy esports for Alpha Draft. They have all sorts of tournaments in multiple different esports games. You can use your brain, you can use your heart, you can use a combination of the two. You can use a sense for, are the numbers off here, as in a player has the stats that say he's really good, but he's going to drop off now for some key reason in the game. Do you just have certain favourite players that you get the sense are going to come back around? This is the place to play, alphadraft.com below. Now then, one of the stories that seems to have gotten a little bit lost in terms of the scale and the scope of the story, with Doublelift going to TSM, and then with this whole H2K TSM drama over getting Svenskeren to whichever team, is that at CLG they've promoted Zikz from being analyst or some sort of assistant coach to being the head coach, replacing the outgoing Blurred Limes coach Chris, and he's the next in the line of CLG coaches. So we had Monty first, then we had Skara, then we had Chris, and now we have Zikz. Now this move, I have to say, first and foremost, I'm quite skeptical that it's going to be a good move, that it's going to work out in terms of him being a really good coach and in terms of him with CLG, the team, achieving a lot of success as a result of his efforts. Now, first and foremost, when I say that, people might think, right, but Coach Chris came out and said it was going to be really good, and presumably CLG have a lot of faith in this guy, and maybe even the players like him. In fact, from talking to a lot of ex-CLG players, I never really heard any of them complain about his personality, and they all liked how he was a hard worker, seemed to be a good guy. So all of this is great. They obviously want to hope he'll do well. They want to be ambitious and believe he will. And none of us can really know if he will or not. We can make an estimated guess, an educated guess. We can approximate what will happen. We can try and extrapolate from what we do know to where we think it'll go. And that's essentially the job of people who are in the role of punditry or analysis, is to do that. It's not just to wait until something happens and then say what happened in hindsight. That's the second half of it. It's to actually look at something before it happens and anticipate what might happen and consider the possible principles that will be at play and the philosophies that will guide what will happen there. So I look at this move and I'm fairly skeptical for a number of reasons. First and foremost, let's look at the person we're talking about, Zikz. Now, as a person, he's not someone you've heard very much of in public, but what we have seen of him on video, what I've heard from people who've been in teams with him and people who've been around the scene with him, and what I've been able to read and see from his personality, he seems like quite a quiet and in general not very assertive guy. Like, he's a guy who does his stuff, does his work, provides information people want, talks to people as they want, but he's not someone who's going to necessarily force his opinion on them or be assertive in the sense of like, this is what I'm going to do. People have to do their part, and here's my part that's going to be taken this way. It's not going to be taken elsewhere. So that was in his role, obviously, as an analyst, because that's the key thing. He's coming not just as a fresh person to become a coach, but he's coming from an analysis role in CLG. Now, one of the things I always found very curious about Zikz's role within CLG is he seems to be the only person I've never seen get much blame, like publicly or internally. Like, as far as I can see, he was never up for being fired or being replaced. He was never anyone that a coach threw under the bus, that a player threw under the bus. Maybe in public, people have criticised the pick ban of CLG, but they never seem to associate it with him. And yet, as the head analyst, or whatever his role title would be, he presumably, and this is what I've heard, played a large role in designing the pick ban, coming up with what they were going to do in terms of the stats and suggesting things, etc. And let's think about it. During the whole time he's been there, whenever CLG broke down in the playoffs, or in the case of the last split, not in the playoffs, but in Worlds, whenever they broke down, people, yes, you could blame, like, one of the main things I would blame was nearly always like Link, and then other people choking, Afromu, Zion to some degree in the most recent one. There was people you could look at and blame for choking. There was coaches where you could look at it and see where their philosophy had been okay during the regular season and then had fallen down later, or they'd had limitations on what they could do. These things were all blamed, or were all looked at and given some share of some culpability, some share of the responsibility for what went wrong. But one thing that people never did is, even though they looked at the pick bans, and in every single one of these playoffs or Worlds breakdowns saw that, right, the pick ban for CLG eventually just goes completely to shit and just gets terrible. Even if during the regular split it was good, or in the case of this NALC LCS. During the playoffs, it was good because of the versatility they had. Eventually, when it goes to shit, one of the things that goes absolutely down the toilet is the pick ban, and yet he was playing a role in this. This was part of his job directly. Now, yes, coaches can do things differently, players can do things differently. That in itself is going to be an issue, though, because if this is someone who's used to coming up with the information, being the analyst, being a brain rather, and then he's giving the information to players, and in his old role, the players can have a say in it, or they can disregard what he says. He's going to have to be a lot more assertive now, and he's going to have to tell certain players, no, you can't do this, even though they want to do it. So a great example, I think, would be at the last Worlds, we had Zion playing Echo top lane at Worlds, think of the meta of Worlds, where the whole thing about Zion that everyone was talking about, rightfully so, was that he was supposed to have this really wide champion pool. And of course he could play stuff like Yasuo, as he showed us at the NALCS finals, which really fucked with what TSM did, because then they had to pick the Yasuo away and put it mid lane, and really ruined the whole game. People were thinking, right, his versatility as a carry top lane is going to be what's going to give CLG a strength. In the end, it ended up just kicking their ass completely. He picked 6 different champions over the 6 games and lost 4 of the games. And some of the games, the picks don't even make sense in the context of the comp. And the comps are all over the place because he's picking different champions. A bunch of different players are just picking totally different champions each time. So it's very confused in that particular sense. Yet this is a role he's playing. So within his analyst role, it's hard to know that he was even good at that role. Okay, we can give him some credit when things are going well, but then do we not give him any of the blame when things are going badly? I've always thought as a coach that's whack, where you say that when things are going well, that's everything I told them to do. When things are going badly, they wouldn't do what I said to do, or I couldn't get through to them. Same for an analyst. You don't just get credit for when things are going great and then just get to say, they didn't listen to me on the other stuff. Well, if they have input, maybe they had input during the good times. So you've got to be fair on that stuff. So at the moment, all we know about him, his personality doesn't seem to fit with the head coach type role. And the analyst role stuff seems to have some merit to it, but it was probably better, I'd suggest, attenuated through an assertive, thinking, bold head coach who can take some of the information on board, some of the suggestions, and then figure out how to make a compromise between the players who in the past were very outspoken to make it work. Now, before I go into the rest of the matter on this one, I do want to say that it is true. This is the point that Coach Chris tried to stress, that there are different types of coaches. There's not only the one authoritarian head coach type of guy that a lot of us Westerners think of, who's the guy who's going to tell you, you've got to play. I mean, the person I always think of when I think this way is actually Larry Brown, the former coach of the Philadelphia 76ers in the early 2000s, when he had Allen Iverson, who famously he was very contentious with. And then more successfully, he was the coach of the Detroit Pistons, who without a true superstar actually won an NBA championship, made 2 NBA finals in a row, one game from going back to back. So he was a fantastic coach, but he had a very set way of coaching, which is that he knew what he always used to literally say, the right way to play. Not like there's a more effective way, there's a way that I prefer, or there's a way that philosophically I think is the way our lineup should go. He would say the right way to play, and he wanted you to play that way. And if you wouldn't play within those certain bounds, he was going to shout at you, he was going to criticize you, he was going to try and get you to reason you around to his position over and over. And he wasn't a guy who's going to make a lot of compromises in that particular kind of sense, or he would kind of begrudgingly do so. So even though he was a fantastic coach, that's great for a certain type of team and a certain type of makeup of personnel and certain types of minds that you're going to interact with. But for others, it's going to be terrible. So there is that one, which is the one that often we think of when we're thinking of what we want in a Western coach. So Zikz is clearly not going to be that sort of coach. That seems very unlikely he can be that. I mean, you can almost relate that sort of archetype of leader. That coach can be the leader, or you can think of him even as like a father figure, because he has that authority over you, and you have to look up to him. And ultimately, whatever you think, if he says something differently, you're expected to disregard what you think and just take what he says almost as though it was gospel. Then there's the other type of leader. There's a type of leader who's like a tactician. I mean, this is kind of touching on some of the things I went on in my types of in-game leader video for CSGO, where there's the type of tactician where the idea is this guy's so smart, he's always going to come up with interesting ideas or innovative ideas or the intelligent way to attack the opponent, that first of all you're going to be on board because he's so smart, but secondly, even if you did think differently, his ingenuity is going to make you think, he probably knows better, or he has a plan here and I've got to follow the plan out even though I can't see how it's going to play out. That sort of guy doesn't necessarily have to shout at you. He's going to win you over with his smarts, with the way he thinks about the game. He's going to dazzle you with his brilliance and you're going to buy into it. Now is Zikz going to be that sort of coach? Perhaps that's his best chance in terms of, because he's coming from the analysis role, and in theory someone spent a lot of time studying the game and done a lot of work, and people did tell me he's a hard worker. Okay, I think that's probably a better approach to go. The problem with that is, in League of Legends especially, You can sometimes have the right approach, but if a player doesn't execute it properly or doesn't understand the plan properly or just disagrees, I mean, famously, someone like Doublelift might say, okay, well, I'll do that just because the coach is telling him to. But if he, in his heart, doesn't believe it's the right way to do it, he might just do it in a half-assed way, sabotage the whole thing, or just do it wrong and then just be unwilling to learn and think, well, we should have done it my way anyway. So with the wrong sort of player, this sort of guy can't flourish either. With the right sort, obviously he can, who trust in him and understand that he has got some merit to what he's saying. Then there's the type of coach, maybe he can go this route, who's more the friend. This is often thought of as the player's coach. He's the guy who comes to the players. He's like, listen, I understand what you're going through. I understand the way you think. Here's my overall goal, which is to do this type of approach. But I'm willing to take a lot of feedback in from all you guys and try and shape it so that it fits everyone and everyone's comfortable. That's great, again, for the sort of players who don't need the strict stuff, or they don't need the plan to be given to them, who can take a part in it, and there can be a little bit more of a community effort, but with him spearheading it, him kind of guiding the conversations, him kind of being the linchpin to everyone else's ideas. You need quite self-motivated people, quite self-actualized, autonomous people to be able to do that. And I've got to say, there aren't many League of Legends players like that. There's a few, and you've got to take someone on board. Like, for example, if you were the coach of Origin, you've got to take on board the way Soaz feels about how a top lane matchup is going to go, or what crazy picks he's going to do. Because if you don't, if you make it strict, it's not going to be as good for him. But at the same time, other players in their team might need a different approach. It's worth pointing out that the reason I think it's not quite fair to say just because he's not the main type of coach, he's not going to be successful. The difference is that sort of coach, you can see coming in that he's that sort, like the authoritarian type. He's going to be strict, he's going to do it this way. You can kind of see how that's going to make or break the team. The difference is when I'm describing a lot of these different coaches, so you think of the great coaches of all time in basketball. You've got like Phil Jackson. He's a guy who wouldn't necessarily just straight up shout at people. He'd try and be like a little bit sneaky in how he did it. Like he'd play people off each other, or he'd push certain buttons on people, or he'd know that this player's brilliant but very autonomous, so I've got to give him a lot of freedom. This other guy I've got to work on to work within the system. He's looking at the bigger picture, holistic approach, and he's just working the small details to make a lot of it operate by itself seemingly, but as a result just naturally the way it should go. You've got people like the Larry Brown, the authoritarian guy. You've got the Greg Popovich, who's a bit of both. Like he's very much a player's coach. He wins over the stars, but then he also gets the stars to be unselfish so that he can then get the other players to fit in the system around them. The difference is all of these coaches have massive coaching careers. We're talking like 20 plus years. Some of them coaches in like college basketball, or in the case of Phil Jackson, I think he was somewhere in like South America or something where he was a coach before he came to the Bulls. So they all have this massive tenure of coaching, and then some of them have like coaching experience when they were players to some degree, being around great coaches. We're talking about someone in terms of Zikz here who's never been a head coach before. He has zero coaching experience. He has very little that he's learned maybe a bit from Chris and other people he's been around. He's never been the coach himself though. He hasn't had time to develop his identity of what his persona as a coach is going to be. How is he going to do it? What's the rhythm going to be like of when he's harsh with people, when he's kind with people, when he gives people room for their ideas, when he inserts and asserts his own idea and his own presence over the thing and puts his own stamp on the identity of the team. Because I think with a lot of the young league players, you have to do that. Again, likewise, the players are young in esports. When you're dealing with some of the players that are Phil Jackson, Larry Brown, and Greg Popovich are, some of those are star players who are like 26 years old. That's ancient in CS in League of Legends terms. You've also always got veterans on those teams, guys who are 32 and have been past their career, but they can also help with you to work on the locker room ethic. Zikz doesn't have these guys. Now, first and foremost, it is worth pointing out that for the old CLG, say CLG had kept the same lineup from Worlds, I would say Zikz would actually be a terrible coach for that lineup. I think he would have no chance whatsoever, but this is a different team. Even though it's retained a number of the players, I think it's a very different team in terms of its makeup, and so there's a chance here. And what I mean by that is, first and foremost, the reason why I think he would have no chance of succeeding is because of Doublelift. As far as I can tell, Doublelift is someone who, to differing degrees throughout splits in the past, has been good for parts of the splits, not so much in the other ones, and then has had complete breakdowns in terms of trusting people, or just raging at people, or just being a negative influence on aspects of the team. And as a result, I don't think the Zikz will be able to win over his trust because he's already got this history with him, or assert things over to Doublelift, or win Doublelift over to doing things his way for a long enough period of time and make it really work. So I think Doublelift would have ruined the whole team aspect there, and that would have never worked. Now, there is no Doublelift, so that's an upside. That's a chance we've got here. It's also a good thing that we don't have a Link either, because one of the problems with Link was, aside from the fact he's very passive-aggressive, so that's not going to lead to a lot of conflict resolution, he's also someone where himself, he seemed to lose trust in certain people if they didn't do things the way he wanted them to, even though maybe he didn't tell them that he wanted to do it that way. And he's finally someone where, because of the way he would choke in the playoffs, he would take on responsibilities and roles in the game and give things up in the game that would have worked during the regular split, but aren't going to work in playoffs or big games. And he's going to fall apart and well himself, so he can't be much of a leader, can't be much of a linchpin player. And so that sort of a player, I think, would be a nightmare to work with as a rookie coach, because you're going to have to be very skilled to manipulate that guy or to get him out of his shell and to get a lot of the problems away from him and give up certain responsibilities for things he can't do. So it's a positive that there's no link. Now, they do still have Zion Spartan, and Zion Spartan still has these key flaws where he plays super aggro, he still believes he can carry all these games, and he makes these weird picks or asks for certain weird picks that don't seem to make a lot of sense. Like, you'll notice at Worlds, admittedly, Worlds was a very extreme, once in a million years type meta that will probably never exist again. But yes, the great top laners who were dominating the tournament had deeper champion pools. They played certain champs that other people couldn't, but even within their deep champion pool, it was deep in the sense that they had the metas that you had to ban or pick away from them. But then it was deep in the sense that they could have a pocket pick that would be difficult for someone to deal with. So Smebs, Fiora, the Renekton of, well, I mean, technically Someday played it as well, but we're obviously thinking of the Marin's Renekton in that sense. These guys are fantastic on these champs, but it's more that they had a few champs and they still spammed a few champs to dominate the game. Someone like Zion is trying to show off he's got all these bazillion champs. How about showing us you've got two that work on international level? We haven't seen that yet. And so, yes, you can abuse some of that in NA, but I think that's going to be a problem as you're a coach and a guy trying to focus to pick ban in the comps. That's going to be a difficulty there moving forward. So Zion's still a question mark for me in terms of how he's going to work with the team. But again, it's a new team. Maybe you can make Zion more of a star, but as more of a star, you have to focus more on certain champions so we can build the team around you. That's a possibility, bearing in mind their mid lane is inexperienced and they don't have an AD carry right now. Now, one of the things I think that he has a good chance with Zikz that he has to do is he's got to get in on the ground floor with Hui. If he's going to be the starting mid laner and he's a brand new LCS player and he's someone where he hasn't played in CLG before except a little bit, but as like a star player and as a mid laner, now's the chance with no AD carry and no double lift, with Zion as a star top laner and this guy as a potential star in the mid lane, get in on the ground floor with your star, build a good relationship with him, make sure that he's on board with how you're going to do the team, build a team around him and around Zion, and then the rest of the pieces can fall into place and you've got a good start at least, and you might have a good structure for what you're going to do. Finally, the last player we know of in the team, I mean, obviously Smithy's there, but I'm not going to go into that now, is Aframu. Now, for Aframu, in terms of his personality, he seems like someone where if you can get on his side, him on your side rather, he can win over other people in the team. He can be the locker room leader in that sense. So I think if he does a good job of getting him on board with his ideas, he can serve the veteran role to help with the others, especially because there aren't any massive clashing personalities to some degree within those other players. So I think Aframu could be a big friend to him in that sense. Unless, of course, he left the team and then he could be like, well, he never really was my friend. Oh, wait a minute, is he my friend? Then I guess I spin a D20 and if it lands on 18, that means I say that he's not my friend, because if I do so, then there's a threshold mark where he might have not been my friend and I'll actually avoid taking critical wounds from love or whatever devil lift was going on with that shit. So there's the fact that the reason why I'm laying out that the personnel is going to be so key here is because he's a rookie. So he himself doesn't know what his style is defined as yet. And I think there's actually a lot of luck when you're a rookie coach from team sports. If you get the right personnel for your philosophy and your approach, you can have success. But even then, you have teams where someone seems like a phenomenal coach. He's the right coach for this sort of a team. They're having success and people say this guy's one of the best coaches in the whole league. And then a couple of years later, when the lineup changes a bit or their style isn't as effective and he has to adapt and he doesn't, then things go to shit and they end up getting fired. A great NBA example of this, one that I thought was so overrated, was when Scott Brooks became the coach of the Oklahoma Thunder. And he had these young superstars. He had Durant, he had Westbrook, two of the top 10 players in the league, but even back then Durant was already one of the best, but they've developed into two of the top 10, and they had Harden, who was also developing a really good player, but who had to only be the third best. Now with this lineup, they were sick. They were like playing the Lakers close, who became the champions. They were making it to the final of the NBA. They were making deep runs all the time. Admittedly, they had some injury issues, but as the years went on, his style became less effective. Like he gave Westbrook too much control over the ball when Durant was the best player. There was all sorts of difficulties and off-balance aspects to the team. When they lost Harden, they lost a lot of the attacking threat of that second unit that used to do a lot of the damage for them, get them back into games and push games out to be out of control. His style didn't work as well, and you saw later on, it makes sense why they fired him. They were at an impasse where he couldn't go any further. He'd gotten the maximum he could ever out the lineup. That was years in the past, and now there was no real future with him as the coach. So unsurprisingly, they fired him, and rightfully so. Now, if he wants to be a good coach, I think if he goes to a lesser team now, he'll be a bad coach. He won't have a very good lot of success. He'll probably look crap. If he goes to the right sort of environment, now he might be good, or he might be able to adapt a little bit enough to be successful there. So it's not as easy as saying because you have success even that you're a good coach. It all depends on the dynamic of the team. So yeah, I'm skeptical at the moment that Zikz will be a really good coach, or rather that he'll be a good enough coach that CLG will be a top team. Admittedly, that might not sound fair because they haven't announced the roster yet, so we don't know yet if the lineup's good enough. I mean, this lineup at the moment to me, obviously they don't have the AD carry yet, doesn't look like a lineup that will be finishing in the top 3 of LCS, put it that way. So there's still a lot to be done here, a lot of work to be done. There's some chances, like I'm not ruling it out, obviously I'm giving some opportunities and possible avenues of how it could work, and there's obviously he can develop as a person and as a coach as well, but at the moment my prognostication is I don't think it's going to be that great a move. I'm quite skeptical of it, and as a final point, if he was such a wonderful prospective coach, I mean, what was the delay? Why try out Skara, who didn't really work out on Dig and wasn't an assertive person himself? Why try out this coach Chris guy? Oh yeah, he had some experience at Clemson and blah blah blah, but he'd never been a top coach before. Why not have already gone with the Zikz guy if he had all this background? I think some of that's a bit disingenuous, implying that we all respected him, he was all great work and stuff. I don't know about that. So obviously it remains to be seen. Could turn out to be entirely different. They might have won the off season. Who the fuck knows? But that's what I think. And thanks to Alpha Draft for the Skrilla, because they can trust that I will be a great coach to get them lots of people onto Alpha Draft, as I already have. Thanks. Peace.